Hi, and welcome to another episode of Talking About Teaching Economics. Today I'm joined by David Chaundy from the Atlantic Economic Council. This will be a special edition. We aren't going to be talking about specific teaching topics today, but I did want to explore with you, David, some of the mission of the council and what it is, because I expect a lot of people might not be aware.
Sure. So I can start and give you a bit of an overview of the council. So I'm the president and CEO of the council, but I've been with the organization for coming on 25 years. But the organization has actually been in place for almost 70 years. We're celebrating our 70th anniversary next year. So we're incorporated as a nonprofit charitable status, but we're really an independent economic policy think tank would be the way people might typically refer to us. So we've been in existence for almost 70 years, and our role and function has changed from when we were first started. There used to be a lot more active economic development activities and trade missions. And as other governments have developed and taken over that role, we also used to do a lot of statistical data collection. Again, and as Statistics Canada has developed and grown its systems, we've kind of moved out of that. So what we've really been for the last 25 plus years is really that research organization. And what people value as is this independent voice. So we are not a lobby for a particular industry association or for a business group or for a labor group. We are not speaking for government. We are this broad base, looking at the data, looking at the research and saying, this is what we think matters for this region. So our focus is Atlantic Canada, the four Atlantic provinces. And our mission is really to help ensure a healthy, inclusive, and sustainable economy. And we do that by providing our research, helping identify insights and ideas. So not just, okay, this is what we see as the problem, but what do we need to do about it?
Right.
To help businesses, decision makers in educational institutions and governments make informed and better decisions to help this region prosper.
Great. No, and I know you guys have done, I've been aware of your work for years and followed some of it. And you've come up with some interesting approaches to things, which is really, really good. But I did want to ask you, like, how does, I think it's fairly straightforward for me to understand how someone ends up in my role as a professor. I mean, it's a fairly well-established path. How did you come to be involved with the Atlantic Economic Council? And how did you get there?
Sure. So there's really maybe two steps to that story. One is, why did I get into economics? And then why did I end up at the council? So I grew up in the UK. I was born and raised in the UK. I did my education there, my bachelor's and master's degree in economics. And I started studying economics when I was in school. And I went to what would be equivalent of junior high school at the time when Mrs. Thatcher came to power in the 1979, but the early 1980s was a very traumatic, tumultuous time in the UK. Record high interest rates, a big recession, and this was not just unique to the UK at the time, but a lot of disputes with unions. We had a year-long miners' strike. Unemployment went through the roof, and so this magic 3 million threshold of unemployment was this kind of critical threshold. And so I was seeing a lot of stuff about the economy on the news every day. We seemed to be an annual sterling exchange rate crisis every year, and so I heard a lot of this stuff. And then as I started to study economics as a class in school, I started to realize, wow, this helps me to understand what I'm hearing about. And it offers this prospect of good economic policy and good economic advice can actually make a difference. And we can, what do we do about high unemployment? And how do we ensure we have an exchange rate that's flexible? And what do we do about recessions and high interest rates? So that's really what motivated me to, I did 4 years of economics at school to then decide, look, I'm good at math and I enjoy math. I'm good at economics. I enjoy economics. Do I want to go and be an actuary or into business and use my kind of math skills in a commercial setting, or do I want to kind of do the economics route and kind of use the mathematical, statistical, numeracy skills in that? So that's what I chose to do and kind of pursued my career in education and training in the UK. I then ended up studying in the United States, which is where I met my wife, who's from New Brunswick. So after living in the UK for about 3 years, we decided she would be better suited, being back home. And Halifax had the best job prospects in the Atlantic region. There's not a lot of economist positions outside of Halifax, and we knew, like, if it doesn't work, we're going to Toronto or we're going to Ottawa, where obviously the larger number of government or financial jobs for economists would be. So that's why I landed here, and I started with a 6-week contract at the Economic Council to write a report looking at exports and trade post free trade agreement. Okay. And my boss at the time liked that, so she offered me a 6-month contract. That led to another 6-month contract, and then I had some job opportunities opening up. So I said, look, I'd really like to stay here. And so I was made permanent. And it really fits kind of what I like to do. I don't want to be a financial economist getting up at 7:30, forecasting interest rates and exchange rates to make money in that environment. That's not really what I'm interested in. And I know there's a lot of academics who do a lot of applied policy work, but sometimes academic work is a little more detached from kind of the day-to-day kind of business economic operations. So to me, this is a very nice place to be. It's not so long-term, it's not so short-term, and it's really about helping other people understand the economy, the world around them, so that they can make decisions and the region prospers. So it's trying to really serve the region in that capacity. So that's my story of how I got into economics and how I kind of came to be at the council, and I've just had different roles over the years in that capacity.
No, that's great. So what are the Atlantic region, for those of us outside the region, what are the challenges facing the Atlantic region that might be a little bit different than the challenges facing the rest of the country or other regions?
No, that's a great question. And I think in many ways, a lot of the challenges and the big things that we are focused on now are not unique to other parts of Canada or to other parts of the world, but there's maybe some different degrees of how they play out. So in terms of the key trends that we are looking at right now, and what are the key things shaping our region that we think people should be understanding, our demographics is clearly one. We have an aging population. In fact, our population is shrinking in Atlantic Canada. This is a distinction. We have more people dying than being born, and that has been the case since about 2015. And of course, people hear, well, we've had record population growth. Well, that is only because we've had people moving into the region from other parts of Canada or people moving from other countries. But underlying population is actually shrinking. So the role of immigration in helping provide for newer workers and offset retirements is a key thing. So that is where we're different. The rest of Canada is going that way. We've just crossed that threshold of having more people dying, but you see that if you look at births and deaths across the country. So that is a way we're kind of similar but different because we've crossed that threshold. And then with that aging population, yes, many advanced economies and even China have an aging population, but we typically have an older and more rapidly aging population in this region. So again, when you're looking at healthcare and you're looking at a rural population, a much more rural population, around 50% of our economic activity is in our key cities, but that means 50% is outside of those main centers, whereas nationally you're looking at closer to 80%, 20% split across the country. So demographics and that urban-rural nature will be some key differentiators, but every province has its rural communities and its bigger cities and the different dynamics. So that would be a key trend we see. A second one would be around kind of the shift in global markets. We're seeing different global political risks shifting with China and now maybe with India. We've seen that with Russia. So China has been a big market for Atlantic Canada, for seafood, for international students. And if we're reassessing that role or the risk of that, that's important. So we are very trade dependent in Atlantic Canada. Our population, 2.5 million, the very small population. We have to sell outside of our region, and we have a lot of resources that have been a big part of our economic base in the past, and now a lot of kind of increasingly digital technology type firms sending software or clean technology or those types of things that are harder to track in the traditional trade statistics. But we have to understand how that market is changing, and we are very dependent upon that. So again, not unique to this region, but given our resource base and our smaller companies, finding ways to connect into global value chains and supply chains is critical. And so how that shifts and changing US trade policy and things is a key risk and factor for this region.
Right.
So demographics, trade, technology. We just had our annual Business Outlook conference, and we had special conversation around artificial intelligence and what is that going to mean for businesses? What are the opportunities? We've got a lot of AI techie companies and companies looking at adopting this. What's that going to mean for the job market? So this technological shift and advances, again, has opportunities, has threats. Work has created opportunities for people to move to Atlantic Canada and take advantage of a larger home or a cheaper home and keep their job in other parts of Canada. But it also means that people can take jobs elsewhere and not have to move. So that there's some pros and cons of that. And then the last shift that we are focusing on is the transition to net zero emissions. So federal and provincial governments, along with corporations, are committed to getting to a target of net zero emissions by 2050. We have some major energy producers. We have coal production, and that transition and how it impacts this region in particular is, again, not unique, but there's some unique dependence upon home heating oil. We've just seen that recently. More rural communities, people driving around longer distances. I was just in Northern New Brunswick last week. I was in Western Newfoundland earlier. Just the distances from community to community, how many electrical vehicle charging stations are you reasonably going to be able to have, and would that work here? So again, not unique, but so the way the story of those trends actually play out certainly does have some unique factors. So I think how we navigate that transition with an aging population, being connected to global markets, utilizing technology, those are some of the key things, and ensuring it's inclusive and making sure that it's not just certain communities or certain individuals, but everyone in these transitions has a chance to prosper.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So in the near term, what do you see as the big policy shift that's going to be coming out? Because I know you do a lot of policy work as well. What's the big policy shift that we might see in the region?
I think in terms of policy issues, I think the big one right now is this transition to net zero. And it's not that it's new, it's just that we don't yet know the full plan, right? We've got some existing policies, we've got some carbon pricing, we've got some regulatory standards coming in around getting off coal, clean electricity, but these are still playing themselves out. So although we kind of know in principle what's coming or what the target is, exactly how that works out, how we get off coal, who pays for that, what the cost is. These are some fairly big questions. And you think we've got a refinery that's going under strategic review. What happens to that? In 100 years, if we're no longer driving gasoline-powered vehicles and we're no longer using that refinery, if it exists, has to be producing something very different. So what does that look like, and what does that transition like? So I think this transition on the environment is kind of the biggest policy shift. We're really reinventing our economy, how we live, how we heat our homes, how we travel. And for a small region like this, relying on air access, relying upon marine for a lot of its exports, how those shifts take place are really going to be quite significant for this region. So to me, that is the biggest one. But I think the aging population and how we navigate that from a financial point of view, from a healthcare point of view, healthcare is always the biggest contributor to our employment growth. It's always the biggest part of our provincial budgets. But you look at our aging population, and it's not just about, okay, we need to spend more. It's about, are you going to have workers in these communities to deliver that care? Because you've got an older population spread about in rural communities. They can't travel an hour or 2 hours to a hospital to get surgery. They don't have anyone to drive them. If their kids have moved away, who's going to care for them, who's going to visit them, and who's going to be in that senior home? And both my in-laws moved into a senior care facility in rural New Brunswick earlier this year. That facility has a lot of people working in it. And most of those jobs cannot be automated. Bathing and cleaning and helping them. So we have to then have how do we ensure we can attract doctors and nurses and care workers to some of these communities, and how's that going to play out? So I think there's lots of questions and decisions that we still have to work through. And, our road infrastructure, a lot of 2-lane highways in New Brunswick that have to be, or 4-lane highways that have to be maintained, a lot of rural roads. And some of those are very key transportation. We were driving up to Miramichi and Bathurst, and you see how much that road is used in New Brunswick.
It's busy.
It's my first time going up that way, but it's just like, I was surprised how many trucks are on that way. But if you're in Campbellton, wherever your groceries coming from, they've got a big superstore that has everything that I see in the Halifax store, but someone's got to get those goods to that store, and you've got to have a community that attracts workers. And again, bringing in people from other countries, it's not just the doctor or the truck driver or the nurse, it's just they're typically coming with families. So want schools, they want a place for their spouse to work, they want to make sure they've got access to healthcare. So we've got to think about kind of communities and how do we grow and ensure sustainable communities.
So can you share a little bit about some of the policy advice you're giving on that front? Or I'm really curious to see what sort of suggestions or policy initiatives you're discussing with people.
So on the healthcare, that is one area where we haven't said a lot at this point. We've certainly talked about our demographic outlook, and we've talked about we need to be fiscally sustainable. We've talked about the labor force. You need to, whatever the policies are. So that is one area where we are currently looking to do some work to be able to actually help people understand there's an economic dimension to healthcare. We need a healthy population to ensure we've got a healthy workplace where people are a lot more concerned, of course, around mental health issues, around disability. So again, if people are not able to work and we already have a labor force that's shrinking, that's kind of more pressure on that. But then we also need to make sure it's fiscally sustainable, that we have a workforce that's not burnt out and that you can renew that. So we are looking to put together some funding to do work in that area. But we are currently doing work on the transition to net zero emissions. And it's really trying to help people understand, partly raise awareness, because I think the big businesses, the Michelins, the Irving Oils, they know this is coming. They've got their sustainability reports. They're on this, and they're looking at what that means. But I think there's a lot of small and medium-sized businesses who don't really know what's going on. So this is part of our role to try to educate. Look, there's a carbon price and it's going to increase. There's going to be pressures to make these shifts. So what does that look like for your business? So it's a bit less on the policy side, a bit more on the practical side, but we're doing some modeling right now around getting off coal and how we make some of these transitions and what that cost is, because we've made some regulatory decisions that we're going to get off coal by this point. We're going to get off, clean electricity grid by this point, but we don't know exactly what the technology is. And we don't know what the cost is.
There's a lot of unknowns.
So we've made some commitments without understanding the full economics of that. And I think it's important that we fully understand, look, you could get off coal by 2040, you can get off coal by 2030, but there's a difference in the cost. Letting those assets run to their full life cycle. And we should understand what those costs are, and we should decide, is that the best use of that resources? And is that the best way that we transition to net zero? Or could that money that we're going to have to pay, either ratepayers or taxpayers, be better utilized to support that transition? So that's where I'm hoping we can start to say something of value in some of those topics.
The basics of opportunity cost never seem to go away.
Exactly.
That's a great transition point. So you're doing all this really exciting work and talking to good policymakers and businesses all the time. One of the things that I'm trying to do with this is to get some idea of where introductory courses need to be going and what we should be doing a little bit differently, or what's working. There are some things that might be working, like the idea of we pound away at opportunity costs and hopefully it lands. From your point of view, as someone who's engaging the policy pragmatic space, not the academy, what do you think should be done in a principles course?
Sure. So again, I studied in the UK in a different kind of structure of how
Mm-hmm.
we run a kind of bachelor's degree, at least back then. And I haven't been involved in teaching or kind of doing any real adjunct kind of teaching. So I can't kind of speak to the context, but I can tell this is what I think is important. As an
Sure.
economist, as someone who's hiring kind of graduates, people with a master's degree out of some of our programs who typically have done an undergraduate in Atlantic Canada,
Mm-hmm.
have gone to do a master's elsewhere in Canada. So I think three things that I think are important in terms of teaching, and then, in terms of details, what I think the skills that we see a need for, at least in our
Right.
organization, and I think maybe increasingly elsewhere. So I think it's important to demonstrate the relevance of economics.
Mm-hmm.
This is what drew me into the field. And I think connecting, it's okay to draw demand and supply curves, and it's okay to talk about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and it can make sense. But I think the more you can connect it to the real world and the world that the students and their families are living in is helpful.
Yeah.
So right now, we've had this huge surge in inflation and food prices. Everyone's talking about labor shortages. They would have gone to a Tim's Hortons that's had reduced hours, or also been closed.
Right.
Like, we've been through COVID, we've experienced some of these things. So tying the economic principles to real life examples, and how would you apply these principles, or how can they help us think about this situation, and what should the Bank of Canada do about high inflation and high interest rates going to work, and what does that do for house prices and affordability when we're bringing in, and we're having this discussion in Canada right now, and what's the right level of immigration, and is that pushing up house prices, and is it creating pressures in our system that our economy kind of can't accommodate? So I think demonstrating the relevance, and not just looking at it, here's the theory, but can we apply that or animate the discussion about why this is important based upon, I think that really helps engage, because I think I see a lot of young people that they are very engaged and aware of the world around them. And to me, and I know when I talk to candidates we've interviewed, is that economics kind of help them make sense of it. I've heard it from them. And so the more we can ensure that they're connecting, this is a tool. This can help you understand the world. It can help you shape the world. I think that is really key. I think, showing then how to understand the world is important. Just concepts like short-term and long-term. The short-term adjustments, long-term adjustments. So basic principles around, everything's connected. You pull this lever here, and it ripples through the economy, and there's income effects, there's substitution effects, just helping people understand this is a way of thinking about the world that's helpful. And then the role of policy. And, what's we can talk about minimum wages. We can talk about, how the Bank of Canada uses interest rates. So I think, or economic development policy, how do you help a region or a city grow and prosper? Like, what are the tools and principles, and what's the role for good policy? What's the role for good regulation? We know governments can fail. We know regulatory environments can fail. We know there's market failure. So what's the role for policy in helping address some of the things that we see in this world? And whether it's climate change, whether it's high unemployment, whether it's how house prices or rising homelessness, like what's an economic perspective on those topics? So I think, tying it to the relevance, helping understand the world, and then what's the scope for policy? That's kind of what drew me in. And to me, that's key for engaging younger people in this topic, and that letting them see, look, there's potential here to use this, these theories and this research and this way of thinking for good. So that's what I would say in terms of things that I think are important. And I can elaborate maybe kind of three specific areas that I think we're looking for in terms of when we're hiring. So I think the first one is, how do you think as an economist? I had the benefit of doing 4 years of economics at school, 3 years in an undergraduate where I wasn't taking a lot of other courses. It was pretty much all economics. There was an economic history, there was a political economy, and maybe I wish I'd done more of that with hindsight, because you start to realize this used to be called political economy. Maybe there was a good reason for that, and now we just call it economics, but then you get into this tension between economists advise this and governments do this. How do we reconcile why kind of what is good economics doesn't seem to make good political sense? And how do we kind of bridge that gap? So I think, but teaching those economic principles, how to think as an economist and how to take economic principles to this policy topic or to this conversation. And I think just having that good grounding and being able to apply it beyond the context in which he was taught to new sets. To me, that is critical because we're always dealing with lots of different topics. And you may have never touched this topic in your schooling, but do you think like an economist? The demand and supply, short-term, long-term, costs and benefits, do you have these toolboxes and you can just know when and how to use them, not just in terms of empirical work, but just how to think like an economist? To me, that's a critical skill that I don't see as strong in some of the people that we interview as I would like to see.
Sure. So that developing that intuition is so important and tricky to do.
Yes. So that would be the first thing. Like anyone we hire for that role, we need an economist. We need someone who thinks economics. Secondly, just being able to analyze. So again, I know a lot of master's students get a thorough grounding in econometrics and are able to do R regressions, regressions in R and all this stuff. But sometimes the world doesn't present a nice, clean data set to do that. And I think that's where our students don't always have the skills. Okay, I've got 5 years of data. I've got 4 provinces and the national. I can't run any regression with that data set, but what can I say? And do I have a capacity to understand that? And when I'm looking at, I've calculated a growth rate for PEI and it's come out as 10%. Does that make sense? Like what's the historical context and can you recognize when things make sense? So that kind of ability to work with small data sets, to be able to look at averages and do some comparisons and growth rates, just some basic analytical skills around that. And it's not that we don't want or need this more sophisticated skills, but having that ability to use the large data sets, but also be able to work with data and charts in more restrictive formats. We have to do a lot of that. Data is often suppressed for small provinces like PEI.
Right.
We don't always have long time series. We don't always have a lot of, if we're looking at 10 provinces, okay, that gives me 10 provinces. So it's not like I've got, thousands of households or survey responses. So thinking like an economist, knowing how to analyze data more broadly and not just in the kind of econometric type setting. And then I think the third point is knowing how to communicate. And so I tell all my young hires that you're now in the communications business. And so, yes, you've been trained as an economist, you've got the skills, the data skills, the analytical skills, and your job is to figure out what is the story, what's going on here, why did the data go this way, what's behind it? And we spend a lot of time not just thinking as economists, but also talking to business leaders or policymakers to make sure we're not misunderstanding, we just think it's because of this, and we don't realize, look, there was a data change, or there was a definitional change, or there was a shift in the industry. So, but knowing what the story is, and then how do we communicate that? Because everything we do, and I know it's typical on every job posting for economists, being able to talk to non-economists, but it's important we have the tools and the principles, but we have to find a way to communicate that in non-technical language. And so knowing how to do that in charts, knowing how to do that with language, it's about what is the story we're telling. So this is the issue we see. How do we communicate that? So it's very much about communications. And I don't think we do a lot of training, at least from what I know of the economics programs, about communications. So I think building that it's not just about writing. Writing well is the basic, but how do you tell a story? And how do you typically, we write academic articles and you've got a very obscure abstract and you've got a long introduction and all the data literature review and all that, and eventually get to the conclusion. Well, no one's going to read for 30 minutes to get to that. No. And so you have to completely change. You've got to get them in at the beginning. You've got to be able to tell the story, and then you've got to be able to support it. It's not like we're just putting out headlines with no support, but we've got to do the research and the writing and the thinking. Right. But then we have to think, how do we communicate this? How do we do it visually? How do we do it in presentations? How do we write in a way that will engage people? They will understand it, and they will know what to do with it and how to, because sometimes we've been criticized, take it to the next level. Okay, I understand what you've said, but what does this mean? What does it mean for my business? So we've tried to do like some business takeaways. Well, here's the
Okay.
policy priorities. Like, here's the thing based upon our analysis. Look, here's the highlights. Here's what we've
Yeah.
said. Here's what you should be thinking about, or here's what you should be trying to do. So trying to help them navigate that next step. Otherwise, we're putting out reports and information, and it's all great, but it doesn't help anyone.
Doesn't
So
land.
helping,
Yeah.
so if they can't understand it, they're not going to read it.
Right.
So we used to do a 100-page research report, 4, 5, 8 chapters, and it would come out after a year, and you'd hope people read it. That does not work anymore.
No.
So we're doing, series of shorter bulletins and highlights and just the visuals. So I think teaching people or starting to at least equip them with the understanding of why this is important, and then ideally with some of the skills, because doing a social media post
that can move the world.
It can make changes, but
Yeah.
you want to have the right messaging. And if someone takes something out of the report and doesn't understand the context, so how can an economist make sure this is what we should say, or this is how we should say it? Don't say it this way. We need the communication people and the economists talking together to make sure it's relevant, but also kind of accurate and meaningful. And that creates tension. I know I've talked to a communications manager in the past, like just this tension between, well, I'd rather be accurate and be very precise, but that's just not gonna
that's not gonna
make a headline. So it's just this tension of negotiating, like what's an appropriate balance here, that we get the message across and that people understand it in an accurate way.
That's great. I always try and give guests the last word, and maybe I'll ask you for some. I asked you about challenges. What's some good news or some really positive developments that are happening in the region that you might want to share?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. And I think one of the things is we've done a lot of economic forecasting and analysis. And so we always present every year. We've just done it this season. Here's the economic outlook for the Atlantic region. And for many years, and this is where the story's changed, it's relatively slow growth, always below the Canadian average. And there's always been this discrepancy between the economic projection and then which we would present, and then having a panel of business leaders talking about their companies and what they're doing and the innovations and how they're global leaders in their field. And it's just, okay, we've got all this great stuff happening over here and the economic statistics are over here. And it's partly just, when your exports are tied to commodity prices and you've got big exporters and producers, and the small IT company or the small startup, or either it doesn't get tracked in the data, or it's just not big enough, or there's not enough of them to get tracked. So there's always this sense that there's a lot of innovation and some great business stories happening, but it's not yet transforming the data. And so I think there is a lot of positive stuff happening. There's a lot of cool companies. My son is an engineer or engineering training, working for a startup in the kind of clean tech space. There's just lots of great stuff, and they just got some funding. So there's lots of great stuff happening. We just talked about artificial intelligence and some wonderful companies utilizing this technology. So I think sometimes people look at Atlantic Canada and say it's kind of a bit of a backwater, it's kind of not prospering. There is a lot of great companies and stuff happening here, but you are now seeing it in the aggregate statistics.
So lovely.
For the last few years, PI has been leading economic growth in Canada. Our population is growing at its fastest rates in history for some provinces. So there's a lot of stuff happening, which is creating challenges, because now we need homes and we need doctors, and it's maybe happening too fast to be able to have some coherent policies to make sure we've got roads and bridges and to avoid congestion of that some bigger cities have suffered. But there's a lot of positive stuff happening. So there's a lot of population growth. There's a lot of diversity happening because we're bringing in people from different communities than we've had in the past. So again, you look at Toronto's population compared to Atlantic Canada, one is quite diverse and one in the past hasn't been, but that is slowly and steadily changing. So you're seeing that diversity. And I think we are seeing a transformation in our economy. I talk a lot about industrial restructuring. We've lost a lot of our big mines and our big pulp and paper mills, but we do have a lot of companies in the technology space, whether it's clean technology, digital technology, medical technology, ocean technology. There's a lot of stuff happening there. And maybe our companies typically are smaller. Maybe they don't get on the radar screen, but we've got a company like Clearwater that's now been acquired by Premium Foods in partnership with Indigenous. A lot of stuff happening in the Indigenous side. So there's a lot of transitions happening, as we talked about earlier, but a lot of very positive economic activity happening. And it's about how do we ensure that continues? How do we ensure that we have the workers we need? How do we create a policy environment that nurtures that? And how do we adjust as we have that aging population, as we see some communities struggling and other cities growing? How do we manage some of these dynamics? So I think there's lots of opportunities for economists here in this region to apply their skills and help people in business or governments navigate, how do we make the most of the opportunities, and how do we manage some of the risks that this region and other jurisdictions are facing?
Great. My guest today has been David Chaundy of the Atlantic Economic Council.